We are delighted to have you join us today for ADAA's live Q&A, helping your child face their fears and worries. My name is Jolie Busby, and I'm the Education and Training Manager here at ADAA. A little housekeeping for today's session. This webinar is being recorded. Closed captioning and translation are available. Attendees at today's session will receive a link to the recording within 48 hours. This webinar is chat and question and answer enabled, so we encourage all participants to ask questions through the Q&A feature and comment in the chat. Now, I am pleased to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Rachel Bussman is a licensed clinical psychologist and the Senior Director of the Child and Adolescent Anxiety and Related Disorders Program at Cognitive and Behavioral Consultants. Dr. Bussman has extensive experience providing cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based treatment to children, teenagers, and young adults struggling with anxiety disorders and other related mental health disorders. Dr. Bussman works intensively with children who have selective mutism and has created Voices Rising, an intensive group-based program for selective mutism. She also has a specific interest and expertise in the evaluation and treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder, separation anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and specific phobias. Dr. Lynn Sequeland is a psychologist at the Children's Center for OCD and Anxiety and has been specializing in treating anxiety disorders in children and adolescents for over 20 years. She has extensive experience working with children of all ages, beginning in the preschool years, with a special interest in transition into adolescence and young adulthood. She has a special interest in guiding parents and teens through the transition into young adulthood, of maintaining connection and closeness while encouraging and building autonomy and competence. She also treats adults. Dr. Sequeland runs parent groups and gives public and professional presentations locally and nationally. So again, welcome to our presenters today. So Dr. Sequeland and Dr. Bussman, how do I know if my child's worry is typical or more of a cause for concern?
Thank you. And hi, welcome everyone. Lynn and I are very excited to be here, and I'm happy to start with that question. I think it's a really good question because I think probably a lot of people want to know the answer to that question, right? When should I be worried about my child's worry? We know that we could probably spend a whole hour just on that question, but what I would say is that a lot of fears and worries are really typical and normal, right? And they follow some developmental trajectory. Like kids that are a little younger might be worried about monsters under the bed and things like that. And children, when they get older and they become tweens and teens, are worried maybe about their social standing in peer groups. But in general, and we can talk more about this as your questions come in, when worries are sort of transient or they don't last that long, they respond pretty well to like some validation and some problem solving. They might be considered pretty typical worries. We start to worry more about worry when those anxieties persist. So they don't tend to go away. They maybe seem to be a little bit more extreme, like more out of the norm of what would be expected, right? It's one thing to say, oh, I'm worried about my test, and then you get a test grade back and you say, oh, I didn't do as well as I wanted, versus studying for a test and saying, I'm definitely going to fail and I'm the worst and I might not even get into high school or college. Like those are more worries. And I think a big piece is also when there's interference. So when your worry or your child's or teen's worry interferes with their ability to do their job as a kid, be a friend, be a learner in the classroom, be part of their family, and it's like really interfering in their functioning, we would say those are worries that are more of a cause for concern. And I'm not sure if Dr. Sequeland, you want to add anything, but that's kind of my short answer to that really good question.
Yeah, we always look at level of distress and getting in the way of things kids want to do or need to do, like school.
Exactly. Great. Love that. So we're going to start to go into the Q&A. And Lynn, you see that, right? Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sippelin to answer a question.
Is Jolie introducing them, or are we introducing the question?
I think we can choose the questions and go
Okay.
from there, and then she'll
Okay.
jump in.
Happy to help. However, I'm here for you if you need me.
Great. Thank you.
So great. This is a very good and tough question. Someone's saying, I'm trying to help parents whose students refuse to get out of the car and go into school. We're working on a training for ideas and resources. Are there some tricks and tips for this, especially when we're unable to drill down to their anxiety trigger? So this is an excellent question and a real dilemma that kids and parents face. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that school refusal can come for a whole bunch of reasons. And like you said, the anxiety trigger or the disorder that's leading to the school refusal kind of needs to be assessed. Is there a social worry? Is there a worry about contamination with OCD? Is there a fear about panic in school? Is it a separation anxiety concern? That would guide a little bit our interventions and tips and tricks, because we would want to be working with parents to guide their kids, and also working with schools about ways that they may be able to kind of accommodate and take step by step. But we wouldn't ever really drag a kid out of a car. We would be working to kind of make it more positive for them to be there and less positive to be at home.
Yeah. I also think, I was just going to add, I think that the school refusal assessment scale, which is pretty widely available, and there's a parent version and a child version, might be really helpful in identifying how to drill down, because this looks like it's maybe a teacher or a clinician. I think that could be helpful in trying to drill down what the anxiety triggers are. So yeah, really good question. Lynn, you answered that so well. I'm going to jump around a little bit. There's a question here about tween dealing with fear and anxiety around vomit and vomiting. And I think that this is something that Dr. Sippelin and I probably see not so uncommonly, right? And I think one of the challenges, it's actually pretty common, right?
It's very common.
It's very common. And I think there was a really good webinar recently on ADAA about that. So I definitely encourage people. I think one of the things
we actually have one coming up on March 5th with Kim Goodman. So yeah.
Perfect. That's what I meant. I think one of the challenges, like the last question with school refusal, is sometimes it's important to actually understand the nature of the fear, right? So if I've worked with teenagers where the fear isn't actually about the vomit itself, but maybe the social ramifications, like some misperceptions that like everyone's going to think I'm really disgusting, or they're going to think I'm weird, versus it could be that there isn't, there's actually discomfort with the feeling of nausea. So it's actually related to more like physiological symptoms. So I do think it's helpful to understand a little bit more about like, what is it about and what does it lead to, right? Because for some kids I've worked with, it leads to them restricting some of the things they eat because they want to stay away from things that could be expired and maybe lead to vomiting or nausea, or they might stay away from foods that are a particular texture, right? So because we can't, I often will advise based on sort of where the nature of the worries are and what's kind of happening as a result. So I guess the last thing I'll sort of say, and Lynn, I am interested in what your answer is too. Like if I have a teenager who feels a lot of nausea, and I do actually work with kids where they feel a lot of nausea, we might talk about sort of that sensation and sort of the fact that it's very uncomfortable and not necessarily dangerous. And we might check the facts around how often that's led to vomiting, usually not very often. But importantly, I'm thinking of one kid where they actually don't eat a lot of specific foods, and then actually teaches them, good news that I stayed away from that food because now I'm fine. And what we actually want to do is, let's say my patient is Lynn. Lynn, I know you're really not eating a lot of steak and you're not eating a lot of dairy products. And I think what you're getting comfortable with is staying away from things that make you uncomfortable. So let's practice eating foods or being in situations that allow us to both feel uncomfortable, but also see that like we might throw up or we might actually be fine and we can handle the consequences of anything. So I don't know if Dr. Sickelin, you want to add anything?
Well, we're going to talk a lot about a theme about all kinds of anxiety, which is facing fear step by step, and avoiding avoidance as much as possible. So believe it or not, we can treat this fear of vomiting by doing a number of things about showing pictures of cartoons of vomiting, to listen to things in movies where there's a vomit scene. We help kids approach their feared situation again, step by step in collaboration with them.
Lynn, I just saw a really good question in the chat, and I think it'll kind of frame the rest of our talk. So is it okay if I jump in with that one?
Yeah, please do.
It actually talks about like the usefulness of play therapy as an intervention. And because this was capitalized as like play therapy proper, I'm going to assume that the person meant sort of what we might call play therapy or psychodynamic play therapy. And you know, as an evidence-based interventionist and someone who treats a lot of anxiety, I would say I'm a very playful person. So if you looked at my office, you'd see lots of games. I do a lot of treatment for SM and we do a lot of play. However, I would not say my orientation or my therapy style is play therapy, because play therapy in its like, again, like in its capital P play therapy is really about the relationship between the child and the therapist, which is important in any therapy relationship, but it doesn't necessarily do exposures or face fears. The focus is the play. And while that can be fun and really something a child enjoys, it may not necessarily actually address the anxiety. And so my feeling is that therapy with any kids or teens should be playful. My feeling on play therapy in more of a dynamic or a play therapy for play therapy's sake focus, I tend to say CBT and behavioral interventions for younger kids. And what we know where the evidence lies for anxiety is actually where I go. And that means like education about anxiety, exposures, parent work to support anxiety and decrease accommodations. So I think that'll frame the rest of what we're talking about, but I don't know if Dr. Sickelin, you would say anything else about that?
No, that makes sense. This is a good one. I am wondering about a child who is anxious about her anxiety and refusing to acknowledge that she is actually feeling anxious during certain situations and refusal to implement any sort of coping strategies. So this is a dilemma that we face as therapists sometimes, and certainly parents and families face. The good news, like I was saying, is a lot of the cognitive behavioral strategies that we might work with a child on are in the service of approaching the situation step by step. And so a lot of times you could go ahead with gradual exposure to the thing they fear, even if they're saying they're not anxious, right? If they're really not anxious, then they can do the task that's laid out for them. Sometimes also kids have their own words for worry or stress. So they might use stress, but they won't use worry. They might use fear rather than, worrying. So you might also just see if your child has another kind of way they describe how they feel in that situation. And we don't have to call it anxiety, even if it is.
I think that's a great question. I'm looking at other questions here. There's a question here about wearing specific athletic equipment at an intermediate level, whereas like wearing, let's say, sparring gear in martial arts at an intermediate level, and then at the basic level, they don't have to wear that, right? So this might be a child who doesn't want to continue in the intermediate level, but has lots of athletic potential. And I like this question because I think this probably could apply to a lot of people in different activities, right? It's getting a little bit harder, or there's something new about the activity that just feels uncomfortable, whether it's like athletic equipment, or it could be being with new people or anything. So for this specific thing, I think I would obviously have a conversation with my child and be like, wow, you're moving up to the intermediate level. Like maybe you have a bunch of feelings about that. I'm curious how you're feeling. So you notice when I say that, I'm not saying, that's so awesome, you must be so super excited, because they might feel kind of pressure to say, oh yeah, I'm really excited, versus saying like, how do you feel? You're leaving it kind of open. And then they might say that they're like not wanting to wear the sparring gear. And again, if you're curious about it and you're like, I'd really like to know more about that. Like, what about it? Because you might be thinking they're worried because it's hot, but actually they're worried because they're wondering who else wore it before them. So we don't actually know why they're worried. And then one thing I would like to do, again, you're going to hear us say this a lot, is exposure, exposure, exposure. So maybe we take the sparring gear home and we put it on for 5 minutes a day or for 10 minutes, or we wear the helmet, but we don't wear the gloves. And I think we just kind of practice doing things that are uncomfortable and seeing how it goes. Maybe the child thinks they're going to look super weird or like odd. And of course, you as the parent might be thinking, they're not going to look weird or odd. Everybody's wearing it. But for kids who have social anxiety or just worries in general, that just feels really weird for them. So I think being curious about, tell me about that. I want to know more about it. And then also laying out, like you could say in just the basic level, but I actually think you might get bored. I actually think you might miss out on some cool stuff. And then like, let's try out this sparring equipment. Let's see what it's like. So that I think is how I would feel. And I'd say the same thing with an instrument or with toe shoes or with, using a more advanced lacrosse stick. I think I see it the same way.
Mm-hmm. There's another good question here. My daughter gets fearful and anxious when she is reprimanded. I lost the question because we went, oh yes, especially of her dad. And when questioned, said she is scared that he will beat her. This is unfounded. I don't understand her fear and how she completely cowers, right? A lot of families and parents have something like this, where anxious kids feel like strong, firm parent voices are yelling. That's, I would say, like 90% of the kids I see do interpret, a firm, strong voice as yelling. So we help differentiate between a clear and firm voice, my parent voice that I'm serious, versus serious yelling. With this one, if there is not a particular experience, we would really help this child talk back to the anxiety and label this as anxiety rather than the truth about the situation, and reiterate, that about my safety with my dad. That's my thoughts about that one. I don't know what if you want to add, Rachel.
Yeah, I think really, really, really good question. I definitely agree. I also think that sometimes kids who are anxious can be really sensitive, right, to tone of voice and things like that. So I think really good answer. I know that Jolie is helping me find a specific question about. Jolie, would you mind reading it, or maybe?
Absolutely. It's from our chat. It says, what are some approaches that parents of younger children, 6 to 10 years old, can take when they have physical behaviors that seem anxiety, stress related, specific to my child with ADHD, tics, mild anxiety, finger and toenail biting, cuticle picking? If they aren't bothered, do I just ignore it, or how do I gently redirect?
Got it. Okay. So I think there's a lot there, right? So I hear my brain heard two questions, and what I want to start by, and then of course, I want to hear if Dr. Sicklin has anything else. I think it's really helpful to understand that kids show with their behavior, right? Very few kids say, I'm actually feeling some internal anxiety and I'm manifesting it by biting my fingernails, right? Or jittering or moving around in my seat. And sometimes those moving around behaviors or fidgeting can be due to inattention or impulsivity or anxiety. And it's sometimes hard to actually know. And I've seen some misdiagnosis of ADHD when it was anxiety. I'm not saying that you can't have ADHD and anxiety. Plenty of kids do. So I do think that the first piece is when we're trying to determine sort of the origin. That's why I think when you do see a treatment provider, like I'm assuming that Dr. Sicklin does this too, when I see a person, I not only get a narrative, like I talk to them about their concerns, but we get some rating scales that are normed, and we get rating scales across a variety of things like attentional pieces or around anxiety, around mood. And we start to like pull information together and formulate some hypotheses about where we think this is coming from. Sometimes I often treat anxiety symptoms first and see how that resolves. And then I can see some of what might be underlying ADHD or not. I think to the second question, I think that's a tricky one, right? So sometimes parents are much more bothered by certain behaviors than the child is, right? So let's say a child is doing a lot of like blinking, or they're picking at their fingers, and they're fine, and they're not hurting themselves. So their fingers aren't bleeding, or they're not causing massive levels of harm or distress. Sometimes actually we do just kind of like let it go a little bit, because tics can be, for example, hard to treat without like pretty high awareness and motivation. That being said, you could really do some damage to some toenails or cuticles. And so I do think that there are definitely helpful tools for that. I actually really like a book that I'm going to look for on my shelf. And I do not get paid for this endorsement. Lynn, I don't know if you know this one. It's called What to Do When Bad Habits Take Hold. And maybe Jolie, you could pop it in the chat or something. And this author is great because she writes, Dawn Hubner, writes really like CBT based workbooks. I do not, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, for everything, which is great. One for OCD, one for worry,
Tons of things. I do not recommend you just handing it to your child. I actually recommend parents doing it with them and taking a very active approach. I've actually used these in therapy with kids. But I do think what's in here is it breaks down these habits like fingernail biting, twirling hair, pulling hair, and gives like a bunch of tools and strategies. And I think that can be having something really tangible. And here's a nice, going back to play therapy. If you just played, right, or colored or talked about your feelings around fingernail biting or skin picking or hair twirling, you might not actually get to the tools. Whereas you could have a very playful approach with a kid and color and play and do Play-Doh and play a game, and also incorporate some really specific strategies. So I'll leave that there, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Sickland.
Great. We're getting some wonderful questions.
I know, we're getting such great questions.
This is another one that's relevant to a lot of people. What strategies do you recommend for supporting a child in the middle of the acutely anxious moment, like when she's been unexpectedly confronted with a fear? Again, unexpected, unplanned are some of the hardest for kids with anxiety. Certainly, if your child has been in therapy and has learned tools for soothing themselves or relaxation, and others could be helpful. But we're going to talk a lot about the fact is to not be afraid of being anxious. And sometimes we don't have to do a lot in that moment. We're kind of staying steady, not leaving the situation or running away from it, and helping your presence kind of calm the child down in the moment, because they can't think of their strategies when they're at acute anxiety or high anxiety. So we might not be able to do much to help except kind of waiting for that fear to go away. And when confronted with a new situation, kids often find that they can have really intense anxiety, but in 5 to 10 minutes, it begins to go down, and they find that they might have a level of anxiety that they can handle. I think parents try a lot to fix everything, to take the child out of the situation, to remove any barriers, and those are kind of suggesting to the child that this situation is dangerous for them to be in, rather than they're experiencing some anxiety.
Helpful. I'm going to go back to a question we had before to clarify that the sparring question was less about the costume or the equipment, and it was more about the sparring with another child. And so there's a social piece of like the other kids are kind of aggressive. And obviously when you're sparring, someone's coming at you. Again, I like this question because I think it can apply to a lot of different sports and activities. And I would say exposure, step by step. Maybe sparring with the whole class isn't where your child is at right now. Maybe that's actually too hard for them, but perhaps they could have some time with the coach 15 minutes before class and one peer, and maybe do some just brief sparring. And maybe the coach or the teacher would be able to pick a child. Like we all know there are some kids that go at it really gung-ho, and maybe there's another child that would know, hey, Lynn's actually a little nervous. She's working on being brave around sparring, but we're actually going to just practice doing like a little bit of sparring. So instead of sparring at 10 out of 10, we're going to spar at 5 out of 10. And so I think that maybe like doing step by step, maybe I wouldn't want the student or the child to totally opt out, but I think figuring out ways where we could break it down into what would be a smaller step and a smaller step and a smaller step. So I think that's a really great one.
There's another really good one here. How do you encourage kids to be more involved in community activities when they are more anxious or shy? So that's a great one because, again, kids manage their anxiety often by avoiding the situations that make them nervous. I don't know about you, Rachel, but I do kind of work with kids to set up a goal to be involved in at least one activity. Maybe for the fall and for the spring, not nothing. And I work with kids to come up and generate the ideas of the things that they would like to participate in. But in a firm way, I might say, as I said, no activities is not an answer. And if this is a younger child, if you don't have your own ideas, I'm going to guess and sign you up for one that I think you might enjoy. And there's ways you can break that down as well. You can go by the building where the activity is being held and drive by. You can go in the door with your child at the beginning to kind of see the room and where things are going on. You could role play with the child if they had particular worries about talking to other kids or managing some of the social situations. What we really find is when kids can get involved, the anxiety diminishes significantly and they feel so good about feeling competent and being able to master these situations. So like we said, we can kind of break them down, and even social anxiety, we can help kids first, just make eye contact with other kids that they know. And then we can work with them to nod and say hello. We can, kind of model and practice a lot of the kind of fears that kind of come up around the activity. And I would always ask what the particular fear is that the child has, because kids are amazing. You would not guess what they're afraid of. Some things that you think they should be afraid of, they're not. And then there may be a specific other thing that one that can be addressed or fixed. But involvement in school or outside activities, everyone has a lot of kids that are extensively scheduled with too many activities, but with avoidant kids, we do want to kind of create the expectation of at least one that they're involved in.
I have a great question here that says, are there any golden rules for parents of anxious children to keep in mind? So I think one of the things I'll say is that it is very common for, I think universally, for parents or caregivers to not want their children to be in distress. I just don't think we even need to take a poll. I think most people would say, yep, I'm a parent. I don't want my kid to be in distress. And what we also know is that for children with anxiety disorders of any kind, they naturally are, or part of their anxiety is fearing either that this is catastrophic or I can't handle it. And they're in sort of like danger, which naturally prompts the parent to help them be out of danger. So I want to say in a very non-judgmental way, it makes sense that parents want to rescue their children. You feel uncomfortable with ballet? Of course you shouldn't do that. Like, you don't feel comfortable asking your teacher a question? I'll email them for you. Like, that's reasonable when your child feels like something is just way too hard. So I do think that one of the golden rules is to sort of remember that rescuing, or something we call accommodation, not the way we talk about accommodation in education, but accommodation like rescuing, is really, really common in anxiety. And it's not to say that someone's doing something wrong. It's just part of the picture. And so knowing more about that can be really helpful to help then kids get comfortable being in a state of discomfort, which is not dangerous, and then doing things that help them step out of their comfort zone. Dr. Sicklin, would you add any?
That's great. And I agree. And I think it's really, you kind of get used to working with and around the anxiety. So I often ask parents to take a day or a week and look at anything that they have to change in the family or the child's day or routine because of anxiety. And you're going to find out that there's a lot of little ways. Like, I don't ask my teenager to make her lunch because she's nervous about getting out of the door in the morning while my 10-year-old is already making their lunch. It's small things that kind of listen to the anxiety and follow the anxiety rules that are kind of made up. And lastly, we're trying to help kids be less afraid of being anxious. Because a lot of times kids and parents expect, I'll wait till I'm calm and then I'll try it. That rarely, if ever, happens, even for non-anxious kids. So we want to kind of say, I can feel anxiety and do it anyway. Usually they find that the situation is less difficult than they anticipated, but we also want it to be okay that they remained anxious in the situation, but were able to cope with and tolerate being anxious. So there's the two things that kids learn from exposures, is that it's not as bad as I predicted or thought it would be, or I can handle what I thought I can't handle. So we're getting a lot of questions similarly from school counselors, kind of asking about how to help kids who are experiencing anxious moments. So all the things we're talking about with parents, I think would actually be similar, for kids in the school setting.
Good point. Can I add one thing, Lynn?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Just on that particular topic, I think another important one is when we're starting to do exposures or brave things, sometimes kids and parents will say, like, I couldn't do it today because I was feeling too anxious, right? Or today was kind of a bad day, so I'll do it tomorrow. And I think I try to separate how I feel in the moment from the action I do or don't do, because otherwise we sort of make it like, oh, well, I couldn't go on the bus today because my stomach hurt and I just felt too nervous. And so then we don't go on the bus, but then we go on the bus the day we feel pretty good. And that actually teaches us, thank goodness we didn't go on the day that my stomach felt a little bit wibbly wobbly. And we actually want to say we do exposures and brave things on good days and quote bad days. We just do them every day, regardless of how we feel. So yeah. I also, Lynn, do you have one, or do you want me to go ahead?
Go ahead. I'm reading a lot about counselors.
I love this question. I love this question about special advice for grandparents of anxious kids. I think the special advice for grandparents of anxious kids is the same advice. And at the same time, maybe you're a grandparent who is really attuned to or aware that a child's anxious. And I'm making an assumption here, but maybe your child or in-law child isn't using the same tips and strategies. And I think that can be a challenging situation to be in when you're not the parent of a child, if that makes sense. So that's how I'm reading it, Lynn. So like my feeling would be to be a supportive person, to be a person that promotes bravery. Maybe you have a book at your house and you ask the parent, like, would it be okay if I talk to Lynn about, being brave at play practice, or that she's doing a sport, right? I think we want to still provide this idea of we do brave things, and it's normal to have all kinds of feelings and anxieties and worries, and facing fears is better than avoiding, right? So I think the challenge can become when you're a grandparent and maybe your child or your in-law again is like maybe rescuing, and it can be like a tenuous situation to try to tell your child how to parent their child. But I think approaching it with a lot of like love and validation, like it looks like, I keep using Lynn as an example, like it looks like Lynn's like really having a hard time with worries about XYZ. Is there anything I can do to support that? I went to a webinar and I've got some really cool tips. Can I share the information with you? So I think those are some things I would think about. And we are furiously reading so that we can.
Yes.
I mean, I think, do we want to answer? I've seen the Roblox question come up a bunch of times. So Lynn,
yeah,
take
go
that.
ahead. You can take that one.
Okay. Yeah, I know. Like, I mean, I don't think the strategies I might say would be any different than strategies I'd say for any other kind of like bullying. I will say that like, I think there's a couple things here. Sometimes what our ears perk up to or peak up to, sometimes like I have an only child, so I only have an N of one, meaning sometimes I need to check in with other parents and say, my kid is talking about XYZ, like what's going on in your house? What are you hearing about? To just sort of like get a temperature on what's typical or appropriate kinds of conversations, right? But let's say I've already ascertained that some of this stuff I'm not okay with, or my kid's not okay with. I think there's some levels of like, we can try to encourage our child to assert themselves or exit a situation where they feel uncomfortable, right? I think sometimes that's in that gray area. Like there's some name calling, but it's not like to the level of like like bullying really means like targeting your child, going after your child repeatedly. So let's say there's some name calling, and sometimes I've said to my son, do you want me to step in and talk to a parent or a teacher? And he's like, no, I don't want you to do that. I'm going to handle it myself. And so having a plan for, okay, how are you going to do that? Definitely, let me know how that goes. Versus, I think if you saw something that was really highly offensive or really targeted, maybe there were like racial comments or anti-Semitic comments or any comments that really were targeting your child specifically, I think that's where you can't stay quiet, and you might step in and talk to other parents. Maybe you would talk to the school if the school was somehow involved in this. So I think it depends on the level, and I think it depends on kind of what's happening and what the temperature is around the other kids. Dr. Sicklin, that's my best way to answer that. I'm not sure if you would have a different take on that.
No, that's quite similar. I am frantically scrolling. Jolie, do you have another one picked out?
Yes, I do. I was just answering. We had another question about emetophobia, so I was responding. So there's one that says, any advice or suggestions for young children who are anxious about not having both parents in their life and answering those types of questions from their classmates?
Mm-hmm. So go ahead. No, go ahead, Doc. Did you want to take it or no?
Oh, go ahead. I'll add to
Well, I wasn't sure exactly, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I'm going to interpret this like, let's say the child has one parent, or let's say the parents are divorced, or let's say there's been a loss or a death. So there are a lot of reasons why a child has one parent. And also we know that children are pretty curious. I would like to say that I go to a lot of kids' schools where the child has SM or selective mutism, and kids often come up to me and say, who are you? Why are you here? Why do you have a bravery sheet? And I think sometimes parents or caregivers can be nervous about, like, how are you going to answer that? And the truth is in the SM situation, everybody kind of knows that the child's not talking. So I usually just answer it super factually and say, oh, I'm here to be Lynn's helper today, and we're working on brave talking. So my point in that is that it's often common for young children to say, like, where's your dad? Or where's your mom? Or why do you have two moms? Or how come you live in two houses? And I think that, so one is to just know that it's okay that kids ask those questions. They often are not trying to be mean. Mm-hmm. And I think knowing that if your child is being asked questions, we need to give them an answer that's what I would say developmentally appropriate. Mm-hmm. So if you're finding out that your child's being asked questions, whether from the teacher or your child, I think it's great to say, like, Lynn, you're getting these questions. What are you thinking that you want to say? Mm-hmm. Or why do you think, like, what's your understanding of why it's you, me, and the cat living in the house? And the mm-hmm. child might say, well, I have a mom and an aunt and an uncle and a cat. And mm-hmm. you go, okay. So like you could say, I have a mom and I don't have a dad, or my parents live in two houses because they're not married. Mm-hmm. Or right. So I think giving really like clear, factual information and avoiding like metaphors that are confusing. So I'll just say one last thing. Like, let's say a child had a loss, right? Let's say they had a mother that passed away. I think giving a metaphor that maybe you think makes the child feel better, like she's sleeping in heaven, or she's gone, is very confusing. Like you could say passed away or died, but I think, again, like being really clear with your own child so that they understand what it means is going to actually really help them. Mm-hmm. And then I think if they're getting repeated questions after they've been satisfied, that's where like a teacher can really step in and say, all right, guys, we're asking a lot of questions. Everybody's family is really different. There are tons of books that talk about every composition of a family, and sometimes reading one would be really helpful. Dr. Sicklin, would you say?
The only thing I was adding as I was reading the question is perhaps they don't have contact at all and don't hear it all from one parent, mm-hmm. Mom or dad are not in the picture. And again, honesty to a certain extent is okay there too. The child can say, I have a dad, but I don't see him very often, right? It's all right to kind of, help them understand the truth, and also let them be upset or a sense of grieving if they're longing for a connection that is not available to them and is not there. So that was just kind of adding on to, what Rachel was saying.
Mm-hmm. I'll let you take the next question.
Well, I was going to actually throw in, we've had a question come in a little bit earlier and then a follow-up. And if you could speak, I guess, to the extent that you can, about repetitive dark dreams. The question is, please explain repetitive dark dreams where someone is harmed, different people, but it does not disturb the teenager. Is this OCD? How is this
I think
treated?
I answered. So I think I wrote something.
Okay.
Oh, but Lynn, do you want to answer? So I think I wrote something because I wanted to make sure I saw that question multiple times. So I typed something in the chat, but Dr. Swicklin, did you want to add anything?
Well, I would certainly be less concerned if the teen is not concerned. Some, kids or teens get very upset and actually sometimes even afraid to go to sleep. Because what if I have that dream? But especially if you're a teen, one is that we're processing things in our dreams that are coming up in our daily lives. And that's kind of what dreams are sometimes about, problem solving in creative ways or facing situations. So it may be that this child is just working out something about anger, say, for example. So I don't think from what you said, it's OCD. There are intrusive thoughts that are part of OCD, but they usually are much more frequent during the daytime and have certain compulsions and related to it as well that you're not describing.
Great. I see a question here that I'd love to answer. Is that okay, Dr. Swicklin?
Go ahead.
This one said, my tween has anxiety and school refusal. My question is when anxiety episodes are frequent and I'm waiting for an appointment with so it sounds like there's an appointment made with a treating professional, but we're waiting, right? What tips do you have to help with when she shuts down and you don't understand how she feels? I think this is a really good question. I think sometimes we really want our child to tell us how they feel. That makes perfect sense. If they tell us how they feel, we can help them. And at the same time, sometimes a child doesn't know how they feel, or when they're really anxious in the moment, they become really shut down. So I think a couple things. One is if you have an appointment in a few weeks and your child knows that, just letting them know that, like, hey, we're going to see Dr. Lynn in a couple weeks, but not for a couple weeks. So I'm going to be jotting down on this in this notebook, some things that come up for me that mom, I'm thinking about. And if you want to jot anything down so that we remember, we can do that. So that's one thing. I think just like validating we have the appointment and saying we can put some things down so we remember to talk about it. I also think in a really anxious moment or a moment where your child is shut down or not verbal, I think it can be really helpful. If your child is a kid who needs space, I think sometimes you need to give them space. And if you're a parent that likes to not give space, I think we have to practice opposite action and give space. But I think if you're with your child and they're accepting comfort, saying something like, I don't actually really know, Jolie, I don't actually really know how you're feeling right now. And I don't want to mind read, but it looks like you're pretty upset, or it looks like you're pretty anxious. And like, I'm here when you're ready to talk. And for now, if you'd like me to be here, I'll just kind of sit here. And I think like maybe reading cues, but letting your child know it's okay that you're not able to talk to me right now. And when you're able to talk, I'll be here and I can just be here while you're having a hard time. I think that actually goes a very long way. Unfortunately, your child's not going to turn to you and say, that is exactly what I needed to hear right now. So you likely are going to feel a bit of unease because you're not getting back what you're hoping. But I think it's really helpful to know that like you providing that love and support is actually more helpful than you think.
I totally agree with everything you said, Rachel. I think that we know in general that kids and adults too need validation of what they're experiencing. So it's really helpful to say, I can see that this is a struggle right now, right? Or I see this is hard for you. But Dr. Ellie Leibowitz talks about some strategies that all of us use is to validate, but then you be the bringer of hope that they can cope. So we kind of add on to it. I see this is really hard for you, and yet I think you got this, or you can handle this, or you can do this. And those combined together go a long way. I might suggest parents just try it because it seems like nothing, but you kind of believing that the child can cope when they think they can't can make a big difference on its own. This is a tricky one that we run into. How can you advise a dad who has authoritarian parenting style and who's somewhat emotionally disconnected from his daughter who has severe anxiety? I think one thing that we think is education is power, and a lot of times some dads or moms who become authoritarian don't understand how anxiety works, and if they can have some more information about how anxiety works, because it can be misinterpreted as being a brat or getting out of things or not doing what I ask. It may be helpful to ask that dad what his worry is about trying to support his daughter with severe anxiety. Unfortunately, there's some situations where the dad is not interested in creating open communication and support for his, daughter. And then we have to help that teen handle that, right? Yeah. That dad is not willing. But I always invite dads in to my sessions if they can't come to every meeting, because if they can be heard about their concern, and you can address that concern and give them some suggestions about how they might still kind of keep respect, within the family, but handle it somewhat differently than they're handling it now. They're often open to at least giving it a try.
I love that. I'm also seeing a really good question here that goes back to the when to worry question. So tips for a teenager who feels, quote, off, sad or angry, but doesn't understand why he feels this way. Is it puberty or something more? He feels this way a couple of days and then is fine the other days. This is such a great question, I think, because I think what I hear is, so they're feeling, quote, off, and maybe that's their words, and they seem sad or angry, and they're not sure why. That sounds like a lot of kids going through puberty, right? At the same time, I think the person who's asking the question is saying, but like something just doesn't feel right. And like, how do I know when it's more? And I think not asking your child to track it, but maybe you actually tracking it. Is it really just a day or two here and there? And like, is it more persisting? Is it trending up? I think the fact that it'll be a few days and then it resolves, and I'd want to know, is he getting back to his like typical self? Is he pretty much engaged? If I was evaluating the child, I'd say, okay, let's know more. How's he doing in school? Is he still engaged with his friends? Is there a lot of withdrawal? Because I think it could be, we're just going through like a period of having some days that are on or off. But on the other hand, we don't want to throw it out as not concerning. So my maybe unsatisfactory answer is I'd probably want a little bit more information, right? How long are the periods in between when we go back to the not so great? And I'd maybe as a parent take a little data and just kind of like note that. And then I might even just ask my teenager, like, Lynn, I notice totally normal. Like you've got a lot on your plate. I feel like you go through some periods of like, you seem pretty good. And then you're kind of like not so great for a couple days. Like, how do you feel about it? Are you at all concerned? And maybe your kid's going to be like, no, not really. Because like there's stuff going on with my friends and there's this and that. Or they might be like, actually, now that you say it, like, I'm not really sleeping so well and I haven't been as hungry. And then you're like, oh, interesting. Right. So I also think I don't worry at all about bringing up conversations that are difficult to a teenager or tween. I'm not worried I'm going to plant an idea in their head. Actually, we find that, and I think Dr. Sicklin would say the same, we ask kids a question, do you ever think about X, Y, or Z? And they'll tell you yes, or they'll be like, what are you talking about? No, I don't think about that. So I'm not worried about having a conversation either and saying, I just want you to know you keep doing your thing. If you feel good, that's great. I'll just kind of be here. I just want to keep track of how you're doing. And I might actually ask you over the next couple of weeks a little bit more like about how you're eating and how you're sleeping. Maybe you check in with a teacher. That's how I would take a very active approach of watching without grilling my kid.
Right. And then just on the flip side, if your teen or child asks to see a therapist, please try and take that seriously. Because they know their level of distress. They know often how much it's bothering them. And sometimes it might be just a 1 session or 2 sessions with the therapist just to assess, is there an area of concern, and that you can feel comfortable and your child can feel comfortable that they're being listened to and heard. But I would be monitoring, as Dr. Busman suggested at first, and see if it's more situational. With depression, you can be depressed pretty seriously and have no idea why. And there can be no triggers, right? There can be a very strong biological piece to some depressions that impact what Rachel is talking about enjoyment, feeling very hopeless or helpless, having troubles with kind of sleeping and energy. So yes, it's just the flip side is take that kind of seriously. We're getting lower on time, but I think we have about 10 more minutes. This one also seems like a more general one that a lot of parents would have trouble with. What about going to bed in general?
I'm so glad you said that. That was next on my list.
Avoiding bedtime, but okay once asleep. So this one is also, it depends what the child is having difficulty with at the time of going to sleep. Separation anxious kids are afraid of being apart from, their parents. Other kids are afraid of the dark. Other kids are afraid that they won't be able to go to sleep. One thing that we see quite often is parents who have for a long time laid down with their child to get them to go to sleep. Learning to go to sleep is a skill. And if your child doesn't have the ability to put themselves to sleep during the day, during the bedtime, they're going to have troubles with awakening at night and being able to calm themselves at night. So we work generally on getting a child more competent and capable by, again, gradual kind of practice, of doing that. The other thing is it's in kids' natures to resist going to bed, right? They think they're missing something. They want to do something else. So the other thing is to be very clear about your routine for bedtime. To give time to start it and have the kid get settled. And one thing I say to parents is to tell kids, after I've kissed you goodnight or gotten you settled, there's to be no more conversation because it's bedtime. Because a lot of times kids will kind of engage parents again in talking through even their worries. And I don't know about you, Rachel, but I don't talk about worries at bedtime.
No.
Because it makes kids have trouble going to sleep. So we kind of try and do it in the evening or after school so that it doesn't kind of, get them kind of going with their distress.
I agree. And actually, I can't take credit for this term, but we had a tutor once who my son would distract her with little stories, and she would say, "Oh, Jackson, put it in the parking lot." And it would just be a sticky note with like things he wanted to tell her about later. So I will use that term with families and say, put it in the parking lot. Especially kids who have general anxiety often have many more things to talk about. Like, what if I forget to tell you? I have more things. What if I worry later? And my answer is like, put in a parking lot. We'll have plenty of time to talk about it during worry time tomorrow. And I think it's also like shaping away from like, you can go to bed and not have told me all the things on your mind. And I agree with Dr. Sickleland. I don't get into heavy conversations at bedtime. I do think though with teenagers, sometimes their best time to chat with you is not your best time. And I think teens have an interesting window of when they're available to talk to us. So I do think if a teen maybe on a one-off if they were trying to engage me every night in these worry conversations, I would move it to a different time. But if a teenager really wanted to talk to you at night and there's something on their mind, I'd probably take that opportunity.
I want to add something. It's a slight angle about bedtime, but there's a question that says, how would you deal with sleepaway summer camp for a teen with OCD who has mandatory bedtime rituals? And this may be our last question. So I'll leave you with that.
Yeah. Do you want to start or?
Well, one way is to hopefully use that motivation about, going away to summer camp to address the OCD and rituals. We would be working to help a teen understand that they probably can't or may not be able to do the rituals as they do it, and we would gradually work to kind of take away the rituals one at a time. And we sometimes have kids rate of their rituals or orders which are the easiest. We might just have them do a little bit out of order if they have a set things they have to do, they can still do those things, but try and do them in a different way. I would really be engaging the adolescent about the importance of addressing, and changing the OCD ritual before going to camp, because that's going to be hard. Even to be able to do it at all, or also to deal with kind of their peers and other explanations that they would need to provide. Do you have additions, Rachel?
Yeah, I think I would just also say that sometimes families might be hesitant to like tell a camp or a program about their child, and they don't want them to be stigmatized. They don't want them to be like judged ahead of time. I think if a child or teen has OCD and it's diagnosed and it's going to play a role in their camp experience, I think it would be a very bad idea not to share that information with the camp, because I think if the teenager has, even if they've reduced some rituals, but they're still going to have rituals, there are a lot of some sleepaway camps I've worked with who are really attuned to and able to put some supports in place, maybe not to completely accommodate all rituals, but maybe some. So I think I tend to say, give people the tools and information rather than they get your camper and then all of a sudden they're like, oh my goodness, there are 2 hours of bedtime rituals, and now the camp maybe says like, oh, you can't shower in that shower, and that sends the teenager into a tailspin. That would have been much better to have told them in advance.
I totally agree. And Julie, I don't know if we have time, but I have a quick response to this one. How do you talk to a child when their behavior affects the whole family?
Yes, please.
And is that all right? So maybe we can just end on that, that it's okay to seek help. Even if your child doesn't think they have a problem with their anxiety, if it's impacting family functioning, and it does, it impacts siblings. It maybe at times leads to decreased participation in things the family wants to do. It's causing stresses for the family or parents' work schedule. It really is okay to have a goal to address it, even if the child doesn't feel that there's a problem here and it's worthy of attention when it's impacting. And a lot of times people can consult with a therapist about how to address some of those kind of concerns, even if the child is not in therapy, but guiding how to kind of reclaim the family's life from the anxiety.
Thank you very much. I do think that was our last question. We had
oh my goodness, the time went so fast.
It really, really did. Well, I want to thank our speakers today, Dr. Rachel Busman and Dr. Lynn Sequeland, so much for their very helpful, informative, and interesting presentation today. I would also like to say a little bit about ADAA and who we are. The Anxiety and Depression Association of America works to prevent, treat, and cure anxiety disorders and depression through the alignment of science, treatment, and education. And for all of you here today, we invite you to explore our website at adaa.org, where you can find resources such as upcoming webinars, like the one we shared about emetophobia, blog post, and we have self-help books and publications. And of course, please consider subscribing to our free monthly e-newsletter, Triumph. That is all we have today. Thanks again so much for being with us, and we hope to see you on the next webinar.
Really great questions. And thanks, Jolie. Thank you for all of your fielding and help.
Yeah.
It was busy today. Thank you so much.
It was busy today. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.